Welcome to the introduction to the next novel that we're going to be reading, All Quiet on the Western Front. The main purpose of this presentation is to give you some background information and some of the key concepts that will help you understand what you're reading as we start this novel. The first thing that's probably going to be helpful to understand is what exactly do we mean by the Western Front? Well, most of World War I took place between 1914 and 1918. Now, during that 4-year period, a lot of the fighting, if not most of it, occurred on what was known as the Western Front. This was an imaginary line that ran about 600 miles long, all the way from the top of Switzerland, stretching out to the North Sea, and was only maybe about a mile wide. And either side was dug in on, both sides of the fighting was dug in on this side and on this side of the Western Front. The Western Front was part of a style of warfare in World War I known as trench warfare. Now, on this side, both sides dig literally these big, deep trenches that help hide and protect their own military, their own army. And no one on either side is really able to advance more than about a mile to push the other side back and forth over the next few years of the war. There were over 1.5 million soldiers killed during just the first 4 months of this style of trench warfare until the German army finally collapsed in the summer of 1918. The novel itself is a story about a group of kids not terribly unlike you. There were 7 German schoolboys who were sitting in, I know you're all sophomores, but sitting in more like the senior year of their high school, and their teacher asks them to raise their hand, said, who here wants to be a hero? Who here wants to go serve their country? And it's the story of these 7 boys who signed up to do something that they thought was going to be heroic and that thought was going to be really useful to their country. And instead, they got destroyed by the fighting. Not just physically destroyed, but also the emotional and the spiritual losses, the disillusionment that came about from the violence and the horrors of this war. The story is narrated by Paul Baumer, who is 19 years old at the start of the story, and tells the whole thing in the first person. Now, some of the themes to keep an eye out for as you're reading include things like the futility of warfare, the realities of fighting as opposed to the idealism of how glorious and exciting it's going to be. It's not a video game. This concept of the lost generation, which we'll talk about more through class when you get a couple more chapters under your belt. The value of every human life and the strength and power of friendship, particularly the kind of camaraderie that grows when you share a difficult situation with someone. And finally, the long-term effects of war. The author of the novel was Erich Maria Remarque. Now, he himself was indeed drafted by the German army. Yes, this story is told from the German point of view of World War I. Was drafted by the German army at 19 years old, straight out of high school. And the novel is semi-autobiographical. A lot of the things that happen in the book are very parallel to the exact same things that happened to Remarque. He was indeed injured in battle. He saw many of his close friends die. And after the war, he suffered from a post-war trauma that made it really difficult to hold jobs and to stay steady in the rest of his life. He sat down and wrote All Quiet on the Western Front in about 5 weeks, just kind of spun the whole thing out from memory and from experiences, and came up with this realistic, disillusioned portrayal of war that has been accepted by critics and read and won just about every award possible and studied by kids like you and me throughout many generations since this was written. Now, you'd think somebody that survived a war and then wrote a book would be in really great shape after that. Not quite so much, because about the time that this book came into being written and was being popular was about the same time that Hitler and the Nazis were rising for power. Now, Remarque's book talked about how bad war was, and particularly how badly the German government handled World War I. And that's not really a good thing that you want to have people reading if you're trying to raise your own army and trying to talk about how wonderful and glorious Germany is and how you're ready to go conquer the world again. So Hitler and the Nazi Party targeted Remarque for anti-war sentiments and said that he was making the government look bad and that he was actually a criminal. Remarque was forced to flee from Hitler's Germany. He had to leave town. He hung out in Switzerland for a while, and then Hitler even revoked his citizenship and said, if you come back here, you're not a part of this country anymore, and his life was in danger. He moved to the United States in 1939 and spent the rest of his life here, dying in 1970 in the U.S. A couple of notes about the style of the writing in this. All Quiet on the Western Front is known as part of the realistic style of a genre of literature. That means it's an artistic presentation of the actual details of life. Now, realism came out as a reaction against romanticism, which was the style that was much more popular before that. Romanticism tends to value the spiritual, the individual, the experience, the emotional, the details and descriptive. Realism rejects all of that and says, nope, just tell me the truth. I want truthful, brief, objective report style, like a newspaper version of the events that happen. And the result of realism is that sometimes things are kind of unflattering. I mean, if you're going to have your portrait painted, you want people to make you look really pretty. You don't really want that Polaroid snapshot and harsh overhead fluorescent lights. So realism often brings about these kinds of unflattering portrayals of life, characters, dialogues, and settings for the attempt and the value of trying to get to the truth of what actually happened. Now, the structure of the book is interesting too. It actually begins, the Latin term is called in media res, which means right in the middle of the action. So it picks up and you don't really know where you are or who's talking or what's going on. And then through this series of flashbacks, instead of a straight ahead or chronological approach, you kind of start to learn who these boys are, what they're doing there, what's been happening, and then the story can move forward from there. It's a first-person point of view, which means you've got the I voice in the story until the final chapter when there's some shifts in the point of view. And the story and the chapters go on this kind of roller coaster where they alternate between times of utter boredom, where the guys are just sitting around and have nothing to do and nowhere to go and no entertainment, and times of absolute abject terror, where they're about to be killed any second, quite literally. And this really echoes the rhythm of war, this life of a soldier that goes between just having to wait and stand guard on post and then having to absolutely defend everything that means anything to you. It's also known as an interesting term, the station roman or station roman, which is a novel that's made up of themes rather than plot. So this is not so much about what happens in the order that it happens in, but an attempt to kind of gather together some of these big ideas and give you some illustration of that through the events that happen in the book. The book is also known as a coming-of-age story, or the Bildungsroman, which is more of the French and German term. That's a story that chronicles the journey of a young person who goes through a series of obstacles and challenges and then grows up to maturity and often loses a lot of their fantasies and illusions along the way. It usually starts off with the children trusting the adults and the grown-up world around them and thinking that things are going to be truthful, and then learning the harsh truths about life and that maybe the adults were wrong or didn't have all the right answers to begin with. It's also known as a roman à clé, which is a French term for a novel with a key. And in these stories, this is this idea of this semi-autobiographical, where the things that happen are given a little bit of a cover, you know, that names are changed to protect the innocent kind of idea. But if you know what actually happened, you can read it as pretty much a true account of what happened to the people and the events in real life. A biography of Remarque is quoted as saying, "Trench warfare dispelled his youthful idealism, particularly after he carried his buddy Trauska out of the enemy fire, and Trauska still died from a random shrapnel splinter while being carried to the medic." And that should give you enough background information to go ahead and get started. Your very first reading assignment is chapters 1 and 2, where you'll meet some of the main characters and get a sense of this sense of starting in the middle of the story and then trying to flash back to figure out what's happening. So I hope you enjoy it. Congratulations. You're about to open a book that's been a wonderful experience for many generations now, All Quiet on the Western Front.